everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Dangerous Ideas. Today, I'm excited to talk to journalist and commentator Danny Haiphong. Make sure you click thumbs up, click subscribe. We got a lot of important topics to chat on. He's one of my favorite people to talk to. So without further ado, here is Danny Haiphong.
Hello. Hi, Lee. Good to be with you.
How's it going? You're coming to us from New York, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's start off. I mean, I have a lot of questions I want to ask about China, but let's start off with Israel. I mean, Israel seems very intent on creating a much broader war, not just a genocide in Gaza, but they clearly want to create something with Hezbollah. So they keep their strikes on Iran have been such that it seems evident they want it to spread into something far larger. Where do you see this going? Where do you see Israel's behavior and the region going in the coming months?
In the short term, I think we can see Israel continuing to do what it's done to, as you said, Lee, provoke a regional war. It wants a broader war, and many have pointed to Netanyahu wanting a broader war, and I believe this is true, but this is not something that's necessarily new. The entire history of Israel is predicated upon expansionism, this idea of a greater Israel that extends into Egypt, that extends into Syria. We know that Israel occupies the Golan Heights, and that a major pretext for why Israel is currently provoking this regional war has been over the very mysterious missile strike on the town of Majd al-Shams in the Golan Heights on the Druze population, which is Syrian and rejects Israeli so-called citizenship, also known as Israeli occupation.
I know it was amazing to watch Netanyahu act concerned about essentially Syrians.
Yeah, and what's so incredible is that if you look up, if you study and research just the activity of the Druze community and the Druze Initiative, which represents them, you will see that they not only stand against the Israeli occupation, but also for the Syrian government. And whenever there are major rallies in support of the government, the Druze community in the Golan Heights are the ones who are basically leading it. So it's not just interesting. It reeks of desperation, and this has been the case since October 7th, when Israel was struck a devastating blow to its reputation. It was humiliated by Al-Qassam, by Hamas, and the entire resistance, and that has only continued as Israel cannot achieve any military objective, so to speak. It is not strong for murdering tens of thousands of Palestinian unarmed civilians. Now we know that that number is likely almost 200,000 people. That's not strength. What we are seeing is that the Palestinian resistance in Gaza alone is able to hold its own, and that the Israeli government and Israel as a whole, its entire image has been just absolutely dragged into the mud worldwide. And so, in order to maintain legitimacy, some leaders like Netanyahu, but I believe that there are many inside of Israel's government that want this, believe that if it can provoke a regional war, it can garner the support of the United States, of certain European countries, perhaps the vassal states inside of the Gulf region, in order to essentially protect Israel. And we see that now. We see the war preparations of the United States sending aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean, as they did after October 7th, in order to so-called protect Israel. But the fact of the matter is I think what we can expect is that while Israel wants a regional war, perhaps in its heart of hearts, in its absolute maddening and just lunatic drive, at the end of the day, it is very well known that a regional war would be disastrous for Israel, that the only hope for Israel's survival in that sense is if there was a nuclear war that the United States supported Israel over, because the axis of resistance, while many people, and I get these criticisms all the time from people who watch my show, watch our show, who follow these things from the outside, they question, is Iran doing enough? Is the Axis of Resistance doing enough? But a lot of times people aren't considering the fact that Israel and the United States are the least trustworthy nations in the world when it comes to following the rules and diktats of international law and the laws of war. That the United States is the only country to have used nuclear weapons. And Israel, if a genocide isn't enough to convince you that Israel will do anything to maintain even the image of its supremacy around the world, then the Axis of Resistance obviously knows full well that Israel would use nuclear weapons that it has not been transparent about possessing over an even bigger conflict and with much higher stakes. So the Axis of Resistance is going to take this, I think, methodically. They are going to strike back. We can bet that Iran will conduct something like an Operation True Promise, maybe to an even greater extent, maybe showing off more of its firepower. Hezbollah will do something similar, but probably on a smaller scale. And I believe we will see Ansar Allah, we'll see the rest of the Axis of Resistance. Probably there's debates about whether it will happen simultaneously, whether there will be separate strikes on Israel. But I think all of it will be meant to send a message that Israel should and the United States should understand that the Axis of Resistance has the ability to strike and strike hard, and that this can all end, and the threats and the potential for an absolute disaster can all end if the genocide in Gaza ends.
Do you think we're seeing the end of Israel, at least in its current manifestation, an oppressive apartheid regime? Many have said that. Of course, it seems to be happening far too slowly as we watch tens of thousands die in 300 days of genocide. But as someone who grew up Zionist and Jewish, and now, I learned the reality in my 20s. It now does seem like that veil of Israel as this, wonderful democracy in the Middle East, which, I might not have believed for many years now, but many people around the world did. Like, the propaganda succeeded with a lot of effort and a lot of money, but it succeeded. But now it feels like all of that is in ashes. Like, it doesn't feel like Israel can deny what they are anymore.
Absolutely. Israel, at the end of the day, I think what we are witnessing is, in fact, the end of Israel, because while we can't necessarily put a timetable on it, just because there is no real crystal ball, it's not necessarily on the brink of total collapse at this moment. We do know that history is a very nuanced, very complex thing where time is, and also events are very hard to necessarily predict. But what we can do is we can see all of the signs of a crisis of legitimacy, and eventually that crisis will give way. Israel does not have the advantages of, let's say, the United States, even though the United States is in itself an empire in decline. It doesn't have the geographic advantages, and certainly it does not have the advantages economically, politically, militarily. Israel is totally dependent upon patronage from the United States, and it is totally dependent upon a regional situation which fears Israel. And that is quickly becoming something that is no longer the case. The Axis of Resistance does not fear Israel in the sense that it believes that Israel can just do what it wants whenever it wants. What the Axis of Resistance, I think the rest of the world fears, is such a conflict bleeding into an absolute catastrophe for humanity. And that's why we see this balance that the Axis of Resistance is taking, and to be quite frank, the rest of the world, because I think the rest of the world, the multipolar world especially, understands that Israel will ignite a bloodbath if its interests are encroached upon in a way that will facilitate the end of Israel in a rapid manner. But we can see that the end of Israel is here because Israel has nowhere to go from here. Israel has stepped over a line with its genocide, as well as miscalculating its own strategic position in the region. Israel believed that not only could it conduct a genocide, but also it could do so with impunity. And now we've seen in so many different instances that that impunity does not exist, that there will and there have been already major consequences. I know you've covered this, Lee. Israel's economy has been hit very hard by Ansarallah alone, of Yemen alone, closing off the Red Sea. But it's not even just
46,
Ansar.
46,000 businesses have collapsed in Israel.
Right. And thousands upon thousands of Israelis have had to migrate out of its so-called northern territory because of what's now just, at least as it's mainly characterized, a tit for tat with Hezbollah. At any point that could explode because Hezbollah does have the capabilities. And of course, Israel is thirsty for a larger war. So we have to ask ourselves, where does Israel go from here? Do we see any scenario where Israel comes out of this after a 2009, 2012, 2014 mowing the lawn situation? It doesn't come out of this in any kind of stable or peaceful manner. Israel has basically eliminated the possibility of any kind of social peace under occupation. And from here on out, the main objective for much of the world, especially the Axis of Resistance, will be facilitating the eventual collapse of Israel. The only question is, when will that happen? And it's quite clear from the last, what has it been now, 8+ months, nearly 9 months of this genocide, that Israel is very well capable of facilitating this kind of collapse. And I think the world is prepared for it. I believe that most of the world does not want to see this Israeli regime existing as it does any longer. And the only question we have to ask is, well, when will that happen? And that is more complex just because we will have to see how all of the forces at hand, from world public opinion, as well as the axis of resistance, as well as Israel's own actions, how they all come together to eventually create that perfect storm.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much correct. Let's talk about China for a few minutes. You are one of my go-to sources on China. The U.S. seems to just be pushing more and more away from diplomacy. I think the Pentagon just unveiled a multi-billion-dollar diplomacy defense shield that can shoot down any diplomacy that comes our way. But China seems to be continually attempting the opposite, to try and force diplomacy around the world, to force peace plans around the world. Talk a little bit about what the U.S. thinks they're doing, what the U.S. government thinks they're going to achieve, but also to be a little more specific, can you talk about Taiwan? And the U.S. seems to want to do the same thing with Taiwan that they did with Ukraine and the Donbass region, and but yeah, talk about the history of Taiwan and what the U.S. thinks they can achieve by I don't know, weaponizing, militarizing Taiwan against China mainland.
Yeah, so Taiwan, I mean, this history is very important, and we can just start maybe after the Chinese Revolution of 1949. Immediately after that revolution, the United States supported the government in exile of Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT Nationalist Party, which fled to what had been called Formosa by the Western world for a very long time. But he fled to what is now known as Taiwan and established the Republic of China there as essentially the legitimate government of China, which the United States were recognized up until 1971, when the United Nations, or at least the rest of the world recognized it until 1971, when the United Nations finally lifted those sanctions with the US's permission, of course. And then the United States eventually normalized relations in 1979, recognizing fully the right of the People's Republic of China to be the government of China. despite the fact that it had been since 1949. And that came with economic sanctions, that came with diplomatic, that came with many different kind of sanctions in and of itself. And then over that period between 49 and 71, the United States attempted to make Taiwan what it's doing right now, which is making it this so-called unsinkable aircraft carrier for U.S. power projection. And that led to many Taiwan Straits crises too, actually, which nearly led to nuclear war. We now know that Daniel Ellsberg, especially in the second Taiwan Straits crisis in the late 1950s, he revealed that the United States was full ready to use nuclear weapons on China in order to prevent any kind of reunification process if there was going to be a hotter war with China over the Taiwan Straits. Now, we can fast forward into today because, of course, there was this long normalization period. Now, especially in the last decade, but it is certainly become an even bigger question since the special military operation waged by Russia in Ukraine. And now there's a lot of focus on Taiwan because the United States' objective and strategy, military strategy around Taiwan has been entirely exposed. A lot of people were not paying attention to the fact that the US was backlogging tens of billions worth of US weaponry to Taiwan in order to basically create what they call a porcupine situation, right? To arm Taiwan to the teeth so China wouldn't invade. And that is the narrative. But the fact of the matter is that the United States' overall strategy and plan is to prepare for a bigger war of what they call containment. They want to use military policy as a means of stifling China's economic growth, dragging China, as they did with Russia, into a broader war in hopes that that will collapse China's economy. Does this sound familiar? Well, it is the same strategy they tried to employ in Ukraine against Russia, where in reality, the United States and NATO, I don't believe, ever thought that they were going to use military means to bring Russia down via Ukraine. Ukraine was simply a proxy that could facilitate a total arena of war where sanctions in particular would bring the Russian government down. And now we know that there's 16,000 plus sanctions on Russia, and that was supposed to starve Russia. And then the people of Russia would overthrow Vladimir Putin and would install a government compliant with US interests. That didn't happen. The exact opposite happened. And in fact, the exact opposite is happening around the US's strategy with via Taiwan and the rest of the region, because also what has been happening is the US has been trying to build these so-called alliances in the Asia Pacific. One big one now is the Philippines, where a $500 million defense agreement has been reached with Marcos Jr., the dictator's son, who is essentially a puppet of the United States. The Philippines and other countries, Japan, South Korea, these countries have been organized, or at least the US is attempting to organize them into a military pact, a broad military pact that would ensure they could be used as launching pads for a broader war with China.
Mhm.
Of course, the United States is running into huge problems in this regard, given the fact that a lot of these countries have deep economic relations with China, are very hesitant to move toward a position with China that would cut off diplomatic and therefore economic relations. And so the US finds itself in a very, not just delicate position, but I believe a very disadvantageous position where it is trying to build up militarily against China in its own backyard. Because China is in fact located in the Asia Pacific. China is in fact the most valuable and important economy in this region and definitely the world. And so all of this means that what the United States is trying to do is it's trying to bring down an opponent that is in fact even more formidable than the one that has already defeated it, which is Russia. So the United States wants to use Taiwan as its proxy for this larger war, but all of it is not going very well at the moment.
Yeah. And not to mention, you've got a corpse at the helm here in the United States. So uh, you also didn't mention that. Is it 12 countries around the world that say Taiwan is separate from China? And in
Right.
fact, United States official policy is still that Taiwan is part of China.
Exactly. And most of those countries don't really register. Many of them are colonies, official colonies of
Right.
America, France, the UK. And of course, I believe Israel is there as well. They um, they are not relevant, right? They're not relevant to the overall discussion.
I think one of
And
them's Nehru, so I don't know. I think the Nehruese are going to get pretty upset with you saying they're not relevant.
and it's so interesting because it would be interesting to see what people in those countries actually believe,
Right.
given that their governments are most likely just satellites of the United States, and so that's the diplomatic position the United States is in on this question. No one around the world, even prominent European countries that have so bowed down to the United States on Ukraine, want to see a broader war with China. Most of Europe, even though the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, people like Emmanuel Macron, will shoot themselves in the foot and play footsie with the US around economic war. The question of a broader military strategy against China is, for the most part, out of the question, maybe outside of the UK and Australia, which are kind of special junior colonies at this point of the United States. But most of Europe does not want to see a broader war because they know that if there is any major military conflict between the United States and China, Europe's economy is going to be in an even worse position than what the special military operation in Ukraine has wrought upon them, the backfiring of those tens of thousands of sanctions.
I often say that we shouldn't let talking about the theatrics of the presidential race or the presidential candidates or anything take up more than 5% of our brains or our time. But I'll use my 5% right now. Do you think there's any difference between the stance towards China of Kamala versus Trump and the ruling elite in general in the United States? And a secondary question to that is, are there third party candidates you like? I know you had Jill Stein on recently.
Sure. So, in terms of China policy, overall, the policy of the United States toward China is no doubt right now and will be hostility and building up toward this broader war, but it will be opportunistic in the sense that the United States is an empire in decline. The United States is an empire that is absolutely mired in just irreconcilable contradictions worldwide, whether we're looking at Ukraine, a losing war, whether we're looking at what Israel is doing, its genocide, which is also a losing war outside of the genocide, if we consider that not only is Israel's prestige absolutely in the tank and its fate absolutely sealed as a pariah state that will eventually fall, but the United States' own position in that region had been declining very much so even before October 7th. Now it is absolutely seen as an illegitimate player. Iraq, every single month, it seems like, is trying its best, despite its very perilous position, to kick out the remaining US troops that are there. It seems like every month the Iraqi government is trying to do that. So, in effect, the United States is a doomed empire, and that means that China, as a rising power, as one that adheres to a multipolarity, as one that is not an empire, that wants to see a world of win-win cooperation, of common prosperity, that wants to see diplomacy and peace. Many people will question, how could you say that? Look at its aggression in the South China Sea. Well, if you look at China's overall foreign policy, yes, it does have to maintain a big and expand its military because of external threats, literally the United States surrounding it like a noose with bases all across the Asia Pacific. But if you look at the rest of its foreign policy, it's pretty stark to see how China is the only major country pushing for peace negotiations, legitimate peace negotiations that involve Russia and Russian interests in them in Ukraine. It's the only major country pushing for a real end to the genocide, along with Russia through diplomacy, despite the fact that diplomacy is absolutely off the table on the Israeli and the US side. So China's foreign policy is quite clear just on those questions alone, but we can then also look at how it's been cooperating with other countries around the world and staying away from interfering in their governance. But back to the question of policy between these two candidates, or between Trump and Harris, it'll be opportunistic. I believe that Donald Trump will attempt to adopt the same policy that he had in 2016. It's a very important electoral position and political position, especially for the GOP, which is just put so many eggs in the anti-China basket in order to promote America first and to distinguish itself from what they believe are like the Chinese communist controlled Democrats. The Democrats, on the other hand, they have shown under the Biden administration, but even under Obama too, that the overall policy is hostility. That while the Democrats may talk a more maybe professional game when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to maintaining communication, all the policy, economic, military, all of it builds upon whatever Trump did during his 2016 term. So that will continue under Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is an empty vessel on foreign policy in many respects, not only because she doesn't have experience, but because she's essentially an empty vessel politically. All of her political experience is centered on one state. That was a disastrous nightmare. She literally did whatever the major bloc, so-called special interests wanted, whether it was the banks, whether it was the prison industrial complex. She did whatever they wanted.
She's already flip-flopped on about 12 different issues just since she started running.
Yes, and I know many have pointed out her website is essentially blank. It's like a shop and a donate button. Like that is who Kamala Harris will be. And that means I believe that Kamala Harris would govern like perhaps maybe she doesn't have the same personality, whatever we claim her personality is, kind of strange, maybe trying too hard. She's not like Hillary Clinton in that way, but I think she will govern like a Hillary Clinton might have governed, which is doing whatever the elites want whenever they want it, which is a very dangerous prospect in many respects. But it does be, given that she has less of a political career and she needs maybe preservation a bit more, perhaps she would attempt to self-preserve a little bit more than Joe Biden did. I think Joe Biden, even though his cognition was lost, I believe Joe Biden, because of his long years and really just kind of this impunity that he believed he had, I think he kind of went haywire in a lot of ways, policy-wise, especially around foreign policy, Ukraine, for example. And it backfired deeply. And then, of course, with Gaza and Israel, which to me is the real death knell to his administration. His cognition, I believe, is being used as the excuse to get him out because his foreign policy, coupled with a domestic policy that absolutely did nothing, that got him out the door.
Isn't Harris's the same though? Like you'd think if that were the case, they use the dementia as an excuse to get him out. They would want someone who sounds a little different.
Exactly. Well, one, they don't have anybody different that they are willing to support, and two, Kamala Harris, I believe, I believe they think that her being an empty vessel who's so malleable is to their advantage. But this is a miscalculation because Kamala Harris will do all of the things that Biden has done, and perhaps will do more of them depending on what the situation calls for and depending what people around her are telling her and depending on what they want, her donors, and of course, the larger military industrial complex, Wall Street, etc., where they come from. So that is the dilemma. Kamala Harris was a very interesting choice because on the one hand, she could do, say, something. I mean, she really was terrible in 2019, 2020. So at any point in the next several months, she could do or say something or run a terrible campaign and just lose. I believe that the major donors, they don't really care so much about this election, especially on the question of China, because they believe that the overall policy will remain the same no matter what form it takes, no matter what kind of rhetoric is glossed over it. They don't care if Trump is more vitriolic or less. They don't care if Kamala Harris is more vitriolic or less. What they really care about is if the policy has continuity. And I think this is true across the board. We can expect Kamala Harris and Trump to be subservient to preserving and protecting Israel. We can expect that even if Ukraine is such a disaster and perhaps there's an appetite to reel it in, we can expect that the overall policy toward Russia will be the same. And then domestic policy, it's going to be an oligarch's wet dream. They're going to continue to do what has been happening, which is addressing absolutely none of the needs that people really have and fleecing people harder and harder and harder and harder in order to enrich, and enrich these donors, enrich the corporations that they control, and of course, enrich the politicians that they get the they get the patronage from that.
Yeah. All right. I'll wrap up with the hardest question. What gives you hope in these times? We've talked about a lot of shitty things going on in the world. What gives you hope for tomorrow?
Well, a few things. I didn't say, well, in terms of the candidates, I don't think I answered that question. So, yes, I would support any third party that is, pro peace and that's pro worker. And so, Jill Stein, definitely had her on my show. I've been supportive of Jill Stein's prior campaigns. Of course, I know Claudia De La Cruz is also running. I believe that's a very progressive platform too. So I believe, if you're going to vote third party and vote for your interests. But of course, that's not all that needs to happen. And hopefully that vote is part of building a bigger movement to transform this system, which is really the problem. So in terms of what gives me hope, it's that possibility. And I cover mainly global developments at this point on my channel because that is where I see at least the hope more immediately being in terms of accelerating the process to that transformation. I believe that this development of an emerging multipolar world is not only very real, but also already having very important consequences, which are indeed beneficial for all of us, not least mentioning the integration and multilateral organizations that have emerged from BRICS to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on the multilateral scale, and then more on the China-led and Russia-led front. Things like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Eurasia Economic Union have already brought huge developments. And I'm going to be in China later in August, and hopefully we'll get really good footage of what that looks like in China. I will be on the Kazakhstan border, and I will demonstrate just how important these integration projects are for the livelihoods of people and for improving people's lives. And so the diplomacy that we see from China, from Russia, from the multipolar world, we just had, I know you've covered this deeply, we've just had Nicolas Maduro win an election in Venezuela. And once again, the U.S. has recognized the loser, or, before that, they recognized someone they just literally installed in Juan Guaido, or attempted to install in Juan Guaido. But now they're trying to recognize the loser of the election and foment what they did in past years, which is guarimbas, violent proxies to overthrow the government. That is the U.S.'s model of a so-called rules-based international order. China, Russia, and the multipolar world are literally building. People sometimes get frustrated by this, but they're literally building the model that we want to see now. We want to see all countries in the world relate on the basis of dialogue and discussion and coming to terms on a basis where everyone's interests are acknowledged and attempted to be met. That's diplomacy. The way that China has addressed questions like Ukraine, the way Russia has attempted very early on in the Ukraine conflict, very early on, before military, action was launched, to come to the table with the U.S., with NATO, to work out a deal. That is what we can hope for in the future as these countries s- grow in stature worldwide. So that is what gives me hope, because I see that this shift that's happening is moving toward a part of the world which has historically been the biggest victims of empire, historically. So that's the global south. That's the formerly what was called the third world, the world that has seen colonialism, that has seen imperialism in its most harshest form. And when that starts to occur, similar to the Cold War, when the US, when people in the US and also in the rest of the collective West begin to fight, the most gains we have ever made is when those two developments are happening simultaneously. When there is a large shift away from US and Western interests and power globally, like what happened during the Cold War. Many people
Hmm.
don't realize that the Soviet Union's presence was a huge reason why any of the workers' rights that were
Right.
instituted in the United States were given. Not to say
That
that workers didn't
that that
stand
that
up.
doesn't get mentioned enough. That the U.S.
Right.
felt with a competition, the U.S. felt a need to give their workers and
Exactly.
their people things like, Social Security and worker rights, and yeah.
Exactly. So that is a huge point. I think people, I hope in the United States and the collective West, can realize, in order to beat back some of these prejudices and
Mm.
Cold War 2.0 ideological hangups that make us foot soldiers for war, is that we should be applauding China's poverty
Right.
alleviation program. We should be applauding China's rise. We should be applauding Russia's status as a growing, influence around the world. The same with Iran. Anywhere else in the world, we should be applying, no matter if we agree with everything they do or not. We should be applying that fact, because when that exists, when there are poles of power that are moving away from how the U.S. does things, that are moving towards sovereignty and are moving toward improving the lives of their own people. What happens is, when we start to fight, we have more leverage, not only to demand but to win it, or at least, this is a different historical moment. I don't know if the oligarchs would give it up in the same manner as they did then, but at least we have the opportunity to test that theory. But we don't have that opportunity if we become those foot soldiers of war, and we don't, understand the bigger world around us. So I hope, and my big hope is that as that development happens worldwide, as that front builds in momentum for a multipolar world, that makes things that much more easy here, as difficult as it is, to actually get to the point of winning something, right? That's why people
Good
should be
point. Yep.
cheering for the actions of resistance, because if we have a call to end the genocide, the strength of the actions of resistance is in large part what is going to help make that happen. It's not going to be just by our demands alone, because if the region is in tatters, divided and weak, and not able to defend itself, then our demands mean nothing to the US government. They don't feel like they're going to be overthrown because of a call to end a genocide. So it's about making those demands, continuing to place pressure on power, and then uh, supporting those developments worldwide, which can only support our efforts too. So I'm hoping,
Hmm.
and that is where I find a lot of the hope now for tomorrow, is the fact that this momentum is growing, and it is something that will, I think, in our lifetime, very soon. I mean, I see in the next 5 to 10 years there being major, major, major developments, which are going to, if we don't get it together now, we will be forced to get it together very quickly, because
Great point.
a
Yep.
confrontation with Russia and China is going to happen. Just like Israel's final solution was eventually going to happen in some form, right? All of these things we can see unfolding. It's just a matter of when will the moment arise where the unthinkable is here. And that's when most of the change that we have seen positive develop historically usually happens. So
Yeah.
we should just be getting prepared for all of this is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Buy Twinkies. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah. Thank you so much, Danny. Always a pleasure to talk to you. What's the best way for people to follow all your work?
Sure. So you can go on YouTube and find me, Danny Haiphong. Just search my name. You can find me on Rumble as well if you're into Rumble and Rockfin. Find me there. And if you want to support my work, you can do so on Patreon, patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. Find me on Substack too, chroniclesofhaiphong.substack.com. I just search my name, Substack. You can find it. Patreon the same. So that's where you can find all my work. Support it if you can. And yeah, many thanks, Lee. This was a great conversation, and I appreciate all that you do.
Thanks a lot, man. Keep fighting. All right, that was Danny Haiphong. Definitely check out his work if you're not already familiar with it. Always doing awesome stuff. So, yeah, thanks again for joining me, and hope you enjoyed this special episode. I've been doing a few of these because I've been traveling, but you know, they end up being excellent as well. So, thanks again. Make sure you click subscribe and the bell icon, and yeah, keep fighting.